Postmodernism is an intellectual movement that started in the 20th century, which expresses skepticism about grand narratives. In order to understand why it is post, meaning comes after, we have to understand what modernism was. Modernism was a utopian vision of historical progress as evolution. According to modernism, as time progresses, man is becoming more and more enlightened. Postmodernism, on the other hand, challenges certain grand narratives such as objectivity, rationality, historical progress, and identity. The postmodernist critique is a relativist one, since it argues that these ideas are unfairly said to be true for everybody. Simultaneously, there's a desire to topple hierarchies which are said to stem from these four grand narratives. So I started looking more closely at postmodernism this year because I needed language from the social sciences to explain certain concepts that, quite independent from philosophy, had become center stage to my journalism. The hijack narrative. These are political concerns, but I needed language from the social sciences to explain them. And I wanted to ask how important the hijack narrative was for understanding the social sciences, as well as identify how many of the current theories that underpin the social sciences were actually misleading, at the very least for not including the possibility of the hijack narrative. In other words, there are common and broad understandings that we have throughout the social sciences, in politics and philosophy, in economics, in journalism, in medicine, that these ideas occur on the axiomatic level, even though they might be false. And they're on the level of the grand narrative. So I want to ask how important the hijack narrative was for understanding the social sciences, as well as identify how many of the current theories that underpin the social sciences were actually misleading, at the very least for not including the possibility of the hijack narratives, and at the most, totally false on an axiomatic level, on the level of the grand narrative. So I turned to postmodernism to help me in that task. Think of a grand narrative as something that's smuggled in and that serves as a hidden and true assumption. Of course, I was interested in the fact that there was a school of philosophy peculiar to our time that focused on the role of grand narratives. But here's where I part company with postmodernism. Why only rationality, objectivity, historical progress, and identity? It seems they are prioritizing certain narratives. These are the grand narratives that they question, but why are they prioritizing those narratives? What about prioritizing a different set of narratives, such as the hijack narrative? See where I'm going with this? One of the most interesting things for me about the Russian sociologist Alexander Dugin is he attacks modernism not only from the postmodern position, but also from the pre-modern. He speaks of postmodernism as having freed up resources. If you are going to work within a postmodern analysis or critique, you free up resources. This is what has bothered me about the standard Anglo-American conservative critique of postmodernism, is that these well-meaning intellectuals become unwitting defenders of modernism. It's not enough to disrupt postmodernism as ludicrous. You have to ask the question, where do we go from here? A lot of those who think they've successfully refuted postmodernism will turn around and defend American foreign policy, which is propped up on totally modernist grounds. Utopia through economics, the same assumption as communism, if not just worked out a little differently. The idea of unipolarity, as expressed by American foreign policy, the end of history, the neocons, it's a very modern idea, and it has a lot of Maoist presuppositions, because it denies the intrinsic relativity amongst cultures and insists that the American way of doing things and the American way of understanding democracy must be forced on the entire world by hook or by crook. I heard Jordan, and this is one of the things I think Alexander Dugin misses in his book, is once you achieve military and technological supremacy, you're able to steer reality almost as if you're living in a simulation. Yeah, it's more postmodern than he even thinks. I heard Jordan Peterson talking once, and he said that by the 70s, Marxism as an intellectual movement was dead. Both the Soviet variety and the Maoist variety, and everything in between. There was just no denying the death camps and the atrocities, and no self-respecting academic could continue to argue for Marxism. This economic theory wasn't producing any serious intellectuals or anything new to offer, according to Peterson. Yeah, what about the death camps that the United States ran in America? Think about it. Or onto the basements of the universities in California and Montreal where they were doing the MK Ultra. What about the prison torture chambers in Guatemala and El Salvador? But according to Peterson, Marxism by the 70s, and anything approaching Marxism as an intellectual movement, was effectively dead. So change of tactic occurred. What he describes is a bunch of intellectuals basically conceding that they lost the war of ideas, that capitalism won out against communism. So they decided to use the same model of oppressed versus oppressor and just change it into other hierarchies that weren't economic in origin. This is where we are today, where groups like the patriarchy and whiteness are openly demonized by the Democratic Party of the United States and by academia. It's okay to be racist in the New York Times if you're racist against whites. It's even more exaggerated in the field of education than in politics, where there's an attempt to topple hierarchies just for being hierarchy. Heterosexuality, abilityism, as opposed to disabilities, and a lot more. It's seen as good intrinsically, toppling the hierarchies without stopping to see if the ideas themselves have merit or not. We saw an example of this when Biden had to pick a Supreme Court justice, and all the media just insisted there should be a black female, without actually asking the question of who is right for the job. Diversity has become a kind of church in the United States, a kind of inverted racism, because it assumes that any one person from a group represents that group as if the group were one homogeneous whole. There's a lot of truth in what Peterson is saying, but it falls short. And what it doesn't examine is the experience of the third world. And if you're somebody like a Sean Hannity that's worked all your life in kind of one ideological milieu, you wouldn't know if you were wrong until you actually looked at the other side. And the thing about reading and studying voices that you don't agree with isn't that they're going to make you change your mind, but they're going to expose you to other areas of research where you can go and have your own worldview deepened. So it expands your resources. Because you might hear an interview and then go research the interviewee. So, and it's important to know what the other side is thinking, because when you're involved in politics, there's always a tendency to straw man, to caricature your opponent. So just like Peterson can look at the varieties of capitalism and pick and choose, say that some are okay and others aren't, like for example, the Pinochet experiment. And I'm sure he would say that capitalism isn't perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. And he can identify that some people go too far. He paints Marxism with a broad brush as if all were the same. What about the experiments that were carried out in Latin America by the United States military under the influence of economic theories from the University of Chicago, known as the shock doctrine, where they thought you had to electrocute dissidents to start an economy over through shock. They were trying to regress countries' economies. Sort of like how MK Ultra started out with individuals and it was flipped to zombifying the entire world. They were trying to regress countries' economies because they had figured out that with people, if you torture them long enough, eventually their memory will be completely wiped out. The idea was that now we're going to do this to economies. Iraq, year zero. That was a headline from the New York Times. Iraq, year zero. And it perfectly encapsulated this idea. Would Peterson be comfortable painting free market capitalism, which he says he believes in, as all with the same brush, just like he paints all of Marxism with a broad brush? We need nuance. Peterson says, very accurately, that the validity of truth or truthfulness, legitimacy of an idea will center on how that idea is worked out in the real world. Because ideas don't just occur upstream of anything that are done in their names. Although the West doesn't want to color their idealized idea of democracy and the free market with tales of torture centers in Chile and Guatemala and El Salvador and the destroying democracy in Nicaragua and the influence of the Chicago boys and the shock doctrine, and they don't want to color their ideas of democracy with the horrors of the dirty war in Argentina that they think argued was necessary to cleanse their country of Marxism. And here's where I think we have to go even further and consider the effects of the hijack narrative. It's not an accident that the exaggeration of the hijack narratives come from a culture where pursuit of the almighty dollar has been placed above all other countries. So, while I agree with free market analysis and the kind of intellectual libertarians that read Mises and Thomas Friedman, and well, maybe not Thomas Friedman, kind of the Ron Paul camp. I think that reading like Hayek and Mises can become a kind of church where that's all you see. And okay, so Tucker Carlson did an interview with a Bitcoin activist, and he was always complaining, well, they censor me, they shut me down, they don't play fair. That's proof to me that it's not just, the most important thing isn't having the right economic ideas. It's knowing how to present them, and it's knowing the role of power in getting ideas to be accepted or not. Here's also where I can draw from postmodernism. The most important question to ask is about the image and how ideas are accompanied by power. Whether ideas will be accepted or not because of their intrinsic truthfulness, but because of their ability to harness power. So when you talk about strategizing with libertarians, they bump up against the fact that there's a whole important realm of politics that their economic theories can't touch. So let's talk about Milei in Argentina. So he is a follower of Hayek and Mises, and he has been famously campaigning in Argentina with a chainsaw in front of a procession. A very dangerous action, by the way. If that thing goes off with a lot of people, it could have catastrophic consequences. He literally turns it on, walks around with a chainsaw, parades behind him. But it's a metaphor for cutting social services. But this is an idea of the economic tunnel vision, where all he sees is is this paranoia about communism. And I'm going to call it paranoia because look at what he said about Pope Francis. He said he thinks Pope Francis is a communist because of his fidelity to what appears cozying up to world leaders on the left. Remember that Pope Francis, when Argentina was having their military dictatorship and dirty war and arresting students, go to jail for having a Che Guevara t-shirt, or have a man in long hair, you're a communist, disappear forever. Pope Francis was feeding priests to the regime to be tortured, because that's how much of a collaborator he was with the Nazi government in Ukraine. I mean, with the Nazi government in Argentina. Wow, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So, what would Milley say about the dirty war in Argentina? Would he say it's justified? He wants to cut all diplomatic relationships with Venezuela. He wants Argentina to be part of NATO. So it's not just enough to have good ideas. You have to look at what's going on the ground geopolitically. You have to look at the role of power, and you have to look at the hijacked narratives. Otherwise, you're just going to give your ideas a bad name. So I don't think it's an accident. The exaggeration of the hijacked narrative comes from a culture where the pursuit of the almighty dollar has been placed above all other concerns. I mean, we're really in American psycho land now. It's now come out that the moon landing is a hoax. I've been exploring this theme for many years, and having watched the interview that Candace Owens did with Bert Sibrel, Sibrel.com. Okay, moon landing is a hoax. Still though, it'll be years before the social sciences realize what this fact has done to all their theories, all their implicit axiomatic assumptions. There are other examples too. AIDS, September 11th, these events that take the world by storm, that only with a modicum of investigation was able to see are totally false creations, pseudo events. Now, based on what I know of German new medicine, I would include cancer in that. Cancer is a pseudo event. We're back to postmodernism. We don't even need the event. All we need is the perception of the event. It's even more postmodern than the original postmodernist thought. They argued about getting rid of value judgments on events. Remember C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man? You can't say it's a sublime waterfall, because sublime is your own subjectivity. There could be no great tradition in postmodernism because there was only tradition. Because great was a value judgment that reflected a certain idea about rationality, identity, objectivity, and historical progress. The patriarchy, ableism, heterosexuality, no doubt, as well. Okay, I'm articulating the point of view. Now, I'm saying you can't even speak of the event at all. The medium is the message. That's what has happened, is that many of the events actually occur in a simulation and are perceived to be real by the vast majority of mankind. And then even with people that should know better, like public intellectuals, there's action and reaction, and the whole thing is false. September 11th, the moon landing, AIDS, these are prime examples of the hijacked narrative. And people say, you talk about AIDS so much, Patrick, but just like during Italian nationalism, you couldn't say Viva Italia because there was all these small city-states that wanted to hold on to their power. So anybody that was arguing for United Italy, off with their heads. So the people started, this was the 19th century, so the people started hanging up signs that said, Viva Verde. Giuseppe Verdi, the famous opera composer. And it was taken as a signal for a long live united Italy. And then Italy became a country. in the same way, you can't talk about Corona circus online. You can't talk about the medicine for this disease, so-called disease, or you will be demonized and you will be censored. But you can talk about AIDS for the most part, although I have had videos about AIDS censored. And with AIDS, we're getting into the heart of the matter, where this dress rehearsal for the epidemic of a new test and a toxic treatment and the myth of the asymptomatic carrier, where these claims came from in the first place. So now I want to look back at Peterson's words more closely and through the lens of the Nicaraguan Revolution. What he will do is speak of all Marxism as being essentially the same, with no distinctions whatsoever. I've been studying Latin America for a long time, and actually at one point I put my research of September 11th on hold because I felt it was actually more important to research American imperialism. And that's what really interested me, and I said, okay, I can't research September 11th, it'll just overwhelm me. So when my political awakening was really tied into reading about the Central American experience. I remember it must have been about 1989, I was probably 14 or 15. I encountered a couple of activists outside our natural food cooperative in Arcata, California, in Humboldt County, and they told me that the U.S. was at war in El Salvador and there were death squads. I'm really glad that I had that experience. You never know as a political activist whose life you're going to touch. I'm glad I had that contemporary experience to what was going on in Latin America at that time, because Latin America has become so central to my intellectual development as a journalist and as a peace activist. I went back and asked my grandfather about it, and he said, oh yeah, those people from Arcata, they're crazy. But I thought that was a big deal, you know, and United States at war in El Salvador, why hadn't I heard of this? So in Understanding Central America, a book by Walker and Booth, two university professors, actually conservatives, they say that the United States action in Latin America go counter to its interests. It's interesting that if you quote Noam Chomsky or William Blum or Howard Zinn, they'll accuse you of being liberal bias. But you can also find Roman Catholic priests and university professors writing about Latin America that come to the same conclusion. And in the book, Understanding Central America by Walker and Booth, they say that the United States actions in Latin America go counter to its interests because they assume that the United States wants Latin America to be stable, to prosper, to develop, and to do great. A totally different appraisal was given by one Latin American peace activist in the 20th century when, commenting on the wars in Central America that were happening at the time in the 80s, he observed that it seems we have a neighbor to the north of us who believes in sacrificing the blood of Latin America to their gods. What might those gods be? The almighty dollar? It's interesting to think about. Remember, it's often said that by the Europeans coming to Latin America, they saved them from the barbarity of human sacrifice. And there's an element of truth to this. But by anthropology looking for the intrinsic relativity of cultures, it doesn't mean we don't have an opinion about what we see or we have to set our values aside. Although as scientists we kind of do. Although first and foremost, we have to be scientists and we have to observe. And the problem with US foreign policy is they don't observe. They can't understand the other because they cannot even articulate what the problem is. You know, think Ben Shapiro, think Sean Hannity. Or think Jordan Peterson, because the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua at the end of the 70s, they used Marxist rhetoric because at the time, this was the language of democracy that was sweeping the world in waves. As historians who look back at this period, we can observe that the claim for ideological ties with Cuba and the claim of military cooperation with the Soviets was completely made up. they needed to buy arms from somebody. The United States wouldn't send them arms because the United States was doing genocide against Nicaragua. So they bought arms from Czechoslovakia. You know, free market. So Marxism as a tool of analysis that looked at classes and structures in society, an analysis that makes use of class, is understandable and appropriate in a culture just coming out of a dictatorship like El Salvador, or in Guatemala, where they reinstituted slavery, made it illegal to grow food in your own land, and where the U.S. had prevented election for decades. And so rebel movements were inevitable. When you deny the political option, you make ripe the conditions for political violence. You see that all around the world, from Ukraine to Iran. When you deny people the option to organize politically, to have free elections, you create political violence. South Africa, Palestine, Ukraine, there's so many examples. El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala. So far from Marxism not producing anything new in the social sciences from the 1970s onwards, like Jordan Peterson observed in the quote we just saw, one of the really dynamic trends in Christian theology came out of this time period, where there was an attempt to understand Marxism through the lens of Christianity, with an emphasis on what was happening at the time. One North American priest quipped about liberation theology, "I just can't accept it when I see a priest with a machine gun." The manual for the School of Americas, this military base in the United States, in Georgia, and then also in Panama, where they trained Latin American assassins, they brag that they defeated liberation theology. But this American priest said, "I just can't accept it when I see a priest with a machine gun in hand." Just look at any American Army unit, though, and you will find lots of priests and pastors that are chaplains with guns in their hands. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. They don't even need to have guns in their hands if you're a chaplain, because you've got control of all the death squads you want. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Of course, as a theologian, and also as a revolutionary, this school of theology intrigued me. Through all the revolutionary rhetoric, though, I concluded that what these intellectuals in Latin America, including Daniel Ortega, the first president of democratic Nicaragua, what they were striving for wasn't different in substance to what the founding fathers of the United States strove for and accomplished. The founding fathers of the United States also used the philosophy of their time to explain the desire for autonomy, sovereignty, and freedom. Where liberation theology perhaps went too far was saying that we could use the philosophy of our time, namely Marxism, to explain the incarnation and the crucifixion of Christ. Although it is fair to note that the Vatican did expressly bless rebel movements struggling against overwhelming dictatorships, although they offer the caveat that there has to be at least the hope of success, or you could find yourself in a worse position afterwards. The Vatican's interaction with Bishop Romero in El Salvador and their continued stance that liberation theology took some really strange turns and became totally contradictory. Bishop Romero went to Rome to ask the Vatican to help, and he was a conservative archbishop, even though he's considered part of the left. He was like so many Roman Catholic priests that when they saw the position of the society, they actually went over to the rebels and said, no, the rebels actually have the legitimacy here because the governing regime is just so out of control. So when Bishop Romero went to the Vatican to help tell the story of the world, wanted to present to the world about the death squads, and he had a whole stack of human rights abuses that he had documented. And he wanted to tell the story of the violence that the United States had unleashed on this country. Pope John Paul said, "A good Christian doesn't make problems." That's what Pope John Paul II told Romero. Shortly after Romero returned to El Salvador, he was murdered, executed while giving mass. The executioner had been trained on one of these School of the Americas military bases. And then during the funeral mass for Archbishop Romero, the death squads pulled up and opened fire at the people standing outside the church. It was a mass shooting. One of my greatest surprises when I came to Latin America in 2008 was finding out right away that this history is unknown to most people here. It's very surprising. You'd think they know about it. And one of the things that they almost never mention in the official histories written about this period, even by Chomsky and Walker and Booth, is that the U.S. wanted Latin America as their own personal military base with which to bring drugs into the U.S. Governments on the left who wanted to be neutral during the Cold War, were then demonized as Soviet satellites. Governments of the left who wanted to be neutral during the Cold War were then demonized as de facto Soviet satellites. The United States actually enlisted one of their own drug traffickers, Barry Seals, who flowed missions for the Clintons and the Bushes for years to grease their palms. They enlisted him to claim that the Nicaraguan government had made a pact with the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar. Barry Seals did this on a flight to bring back cocaine for George Bush, Bill Clinton, and all over North. This history of Latin America is never considered in the rush to paint entire governments and time periods with a broad brush and associate them with overseas experiments like Soviet communism or Chinese Maoism. And if we look at the Golden Triangle, where most of the heroin in the world comes from, we see that also the United States action in Indochina, Cambodia, and Laos, and Thailand, and Burma. It was meant to keep the drug lords in charge of the country. Because the communists were going to stop the drug trade. This is a secret history of the Vietnam War and these extra operations like the war in Laos and Cambodia. Ross Perot went to Laos on a fact-finding mission. You know Ross Perot that ran for president in 1992? 1992. He found out when he was looking for the missing in action soldiers from the Vietnam War. He found out that the United States was trafficking in drugs, that George Bush was sitting on top of it. And that's why he entered the presidential race, because he had such a distaste for George Bush because of that experience. So the history of Latin America, as it paints entire governments and time periods with a broad brush to associate them with overseas experiments like Soviets or Maoism. It forgets that Latin America was way too nationalistic to accept any type of Soviet communism. And there were a couple of exceptions, like Cuba and like the Shining Path in Peru, maybe one or two more exceptions. And these examples have been milked for all they're worth. But just like we wouldn't associate every excess of economies that self-identify as capitalist or free market with the worst outworkings of these ideologies, and we wouldn't say that this taints all countries that are part of liberalism today, we also would be well to avoid lumping any kind of a leftist government in the same category. After all, the founding fathers of the United States were revolutionary as well. So I much prefer Alexander Dugin because he says, okay, let's use the tools of postmodernism, as ridiculous as it might be, and it frees up resources because we don't have to attack modernism from within modernism. We can attack modernism from the postmodern and from the pre-modern. See, most postmodern observations don't have any respect for the pre-modern. So Dugin can draw from Plato, he can draw from the ancients, he can draw from Christian theology. So what he does is he Christianizes postmodern philosophy. But where I think he goes wrong is he doesn't consider the possibility of the hijack narrative. And in his writing, he'll often invoke September 11th and AIDS. And they're not, all these podcasters that claim to be against the deep state, they're not using the most important tool that they have at their disposal. They claim they want to topple the deep state, but they're not using the most important tool, which is using their platform to unmask the hijack narratives. So what does it tell us about our relationship to technology and amusing ourselves to death when governments can steer reality because they don't even need the event? All they need is the perception of the event. There's a lot of discourse analysis these days from the postmodern point of view, but they don't challenge the event themselves, and this is why we need to have interdisciplinary thinkers today, more than ever, interdisciplinary thinkers. And if you want to know the truth about the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris campaigning with Dick Cheney endorsing her campaign, and the kind of this unholy alliance that we've seen emerge, where there's actually now an alliance between the current Democratic Party and the neocons of the Iraq War era. If you really want to see this for what it is, you have to challenge the hijack narrative. You have to look at the original sin of the 20th century, which is September 11th. There's no end of the mileage that elites have milked from that. So you have to look at these hijack narratives, or we're not going to be in a position to be philosophers or journalists or anything else.